All right, let's continue learning about static fields and methods. We had said we were going to look at the player class and actually try to show you a useful example of using the static fields. So here's what I'm going to use it for. In this big game we're creating where we have lots of players, what I want to do is I want to give every single player that's created a unique ID. So I gave the player class an instance variable, not a static variable, instance variable called myID. So you'll see every single player that gets created is going to get one. That's right here. Public integer myID. Now, you're also going to see I gave the class a static variable called nextID. Now remember what this means. This means it doesn't belong to the instances, it's shared and owned by the entire class itself. Let's see how we can use this to cleverly set up the idea that every single player I create will start to get an ID. Like an ID, the first one will be 0. The next player I create, I want them to get 1. The next player I create, I want them to get 2. And I don't want to have to do this with lots of tricky code. This should be easy to do using the static variable idea. So let's give this a go here. Let's look at the code here. NextID starts at 0. And so I'm just going to go to my page here and go, hey, class variable NextID, your value starts at 0. Now I'm going to go to my runner program, and let's take my first player out here. There we go, and let's start right from here. I'm going to make 3 players in a row, and then I'm going to print out their ID. So let's run through this. I make player 1. It's going to run the constructor of the player class, which is right here. It'll set their score to 0, their direction to 90, and they're going to set their myID variable to the static class variable nextID. Now nextID is currently 0. So that means that the first player I make, their ID, is set to 0. But watch what happens right after. NextID goes up by 1. So we jump here, and the class variable NextID goes up to 1. Notice that doesn't affect the instances. I guess we don't have these yet, but it doesn't affect any instances before you would have made. This is just a class variable that they all get access to. Now let's jump. We made player 1. Let's do player 2. Player 2 is now made. So it jumps to the constructor of player 2, of player. It sets their score, sets their direction, and then says, set your ID to NextID. So player 2 says set your ID to NextID, and NextID here is 1. So it gets its ID set to 1. And then you can sort of see the pattern here. NextID, static variable, go up by 1. So we go back, and we go up to 2. You sort of see what's happening here. When we go back now, go to our runner, player 2's been made. Let's go make player 3. It jumps to the constructor of player, score, direction, myID is NextID, and then up it by 1. So it comes back, well, myID, it's currently 2, shared by the class, so set it to 2, and then up this by 1. Notice how this variable is always sitting at a nice, brand new, unique value, the NextID that's going to be assigned. This is one nice little use for it, right? I didn't just go over this variable, last player created, but I can just peek really quickly to what this does. You'll see here, not only do I do the NextID variable use, but the ID that I just assigned, I have this static variable called last player created. And so every time I make somebody, I remember who that was. Last player created, the class as a whole, static variable, is going to remember myID, whichever one you just used. And so in our case, we just made player 3. We gave them an ID of 2. Last player created would be 2. And so the class as a whole always knows the last person created. This is sort of neat because you can see here, I've given the player class a method that's static, can be called at any time by the class, get last player created. A static method can use a static variable, so I didn't break any rule there. And then in my runner, you'll see the use of it. After I print out the IDs, which should be 0, 1, 2, if this works, I could do this. Hey player class, please tell me the last player created. It jumps, grabs the variable, and now I know who the ID of the last player created was. Maybe I need to do something with them, right? In the program, right? Like send them new information, or I don't know, give them 1,000,000 points. And so it's sort of a nice little use there. Notice this method doesn't have to be called by player 1, player 2, or player 3. Just the player class as a whole can keep track of that information. You're not going to use this a lot in the AP course, but it's sort of nice to know that it's not just limited to you can call the variable by naming the class. You know, there are little uses and tricks that this can be used to do, and that's just one nice example. Now, of course, you're probably wondering, does this actually work? Well, let's see 0, 1, 2, and last should be 2. Game runner on, and there we go. 0, 1, 2, and the last ID is 2. So it works beautifully. It should also be noted, let's say I had a game with 1,000,000 players. There's only one integer variable next ID. It's shared by everybody, right? Shared by the class. Whereas instance variables, you have 1,000,000 players, you have 1,000,000 of these, 1,000,000 of these, 1,000,000 of these. I think you get the idea. So it's also good for efficiency in memory. If your method or variable can be static, you should make it static, right? Way more flexible. Anyways, there'll be another video with a few tiny little extras on this, but that's the gist for static fields and methods, and at least gives you enough that when you're reading documents now, you know what it's telling you about the fields and the methods and what's sort of going on behind the scenes. Thanks for watching.